We begin this hour with major developments in the investigation into Michael Jackson's death. A nurse who says she treated Jackson back in April tells CNN Jackson was desperately seeking a very powerful sedative. It's typically used in operating rooms to sleep. She says that she warned him it could kill him.
In the months leading up to Michael Jackson's tragic death in 2009, a woman existed in the background of his world who would later emerge with startling revelations. Cherilyn Lee, a registered nurse and holistic nutritionist. She had been pulled into Jackson's orbit not through the glitz and glamour typical of his public life, but through a quieter, more intimate role. Her account offers a rare window into the final days of a man whose private torment was hidden behind layers of fame, performance, and increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control over his spiraling health. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. Cherilyn Lee had not been just another medical professional in Jackson's life. She was someone he trusted with his body and, to an extent, with his truth. Her involvement began through a referral, and soon she became a regular presence, treating Jackson for issues ranging from fatigue to insomnia through natural therapies. Unlike the many handlers and doctors who enabled his deeper descent into pharmaceutical dependence, Lee approached healing from a different angle, focused on balance, nutrition, and recovery rather than synthetic solutions. That difference would become crucial in the stories she would later share, not as someone looking for attention, but as someone deeply disturbed by what she witnessed and what she was unable to prevent. From the outset, Lee was aware that she was working with someone whose life was under intense scrutiny and whose body bore the marks of years of stress, performance, and dependency. Jackson's health was already precarious, not just physically, but emotionally and psychologically. He battled chronic insomnia, a condition that had haunted him for years, but as Lee worked with him, she began to see signs of something more troubling, an insistence on a particular drug that no holistic healer would ever condone. It was in her private sessions with Jackson that he began to mention propofol, a powerful sedative typically used in surgical procedures to induce unconsciousness. This was not a medication designed for home use or the kind of mild sedation one might receive to aid sleep. It was potent, dangerous, and not something Lee would ever consider administering outside of a hospital. Yet Jackson's fixation on it was unrelenting. He referred to it by its medical name and knew what it did. He believed deeply and perhaps desperately that it was the only thing that could allow him to sleep. Lee was alarmed. In her professional experience, such a request was not just unusual, it was hazardous. She refused. She tried to explain to Jackson the risks, the potential for respiratory failure, for cardiac arrest, and ultimately, for death. But Jackson, though listening, did not seem convinced. He had made up his mind that sleep, real, uninterrupted, healing sleep, was the one thing he needed to survive. And if propofol was the way to get it, then he would find someone to administer it, with or without Lee's help. This moment marked a turning point in their relationship. Lee had hoped that by offering him a more natural path to recovery, she could pull him away from the pharmaceutical grip that had tightened around him over the years. But Jackson was already too far gone, too worn down by the pressures of life, the looming deadlines of his This Is It tour, and the endless cycle of performance and recovery. What he sought was not wellness in the holistic sense. He wanted relief, immediate and total, from the storm inside his head. And Lee, by standing her ground, was now at odds with what he believed was his only salvation. Her testimony, shared years after the fact, is less an exposé and more a lament. She did not come forward for drama or spotlight. She came forward because she had been haunted by their conversations. She had seen the urgency in his eyes, the sleeplessness that lingered in the way he spoke, the frailty that no one else seemed to acknowledge. While fans saw the King of Pop rehearsing with astonishing energy and charisma, Lee saw a man walking on the edge, balancing between exhaustion and chemical escape. The pressure to perform had become so overwhelming that even his nights had to be drugged into silence. One of the most chilling aspects of her account is not just that Jackson was asking for a drug like propofol, but that he had grown accustomed to its use. This wasn't a one-time request born out of desperation. It was part of a pattern. He referred to it with a familiarity that suggested he had used it before, likely with the help of others more willing to accommodate him. Lee feared this meant he had already found a way to circumvent her refusal. Her concern wasn't just theoretical, it was visceral. She knew what this drug could do, especially when used outside of proper medical supervision. It wasn't a sleeping pill. It was an anesthetic, designed to knock a person unconscious to the point where they stop breathing without careful monitoring. In the wrong hands, it was lethal. Despite her warnings, despite her professional stance, Lee knew she was fighting a tide that could not be turned back easily. Jackson's world was filled with enablers, people whose livelihoods depended on keeping him functioning just long enough to get through another performance, another tour, another paycheck. The human cost of that machinery was never fully calculated. He wasn't surrounded by people who could tell him no. He was surrounded by people who would find a way to make yes happen, regardless of the consequences. Lee's presence in Jackson's final narrative is a sobering reminder of the crossroads he stood at in those last months. He had a choice, at least briefly, to walk away from the chemical dependencies and seek genuine healing. But the momentum of his career, his obligations, and his inner demons carried him elsewhere. Lee, in telling her story, illustrates the complexity of that moment. This was not a man simply chasing sleep. He was fleeing something much deeper. Perhaps pain, perhaps fear, perhaps the crushing burden of being Michael Jackson in a world that never allowed him to rest. Her experience also reveals something about the culture surrounding fame at that level. Celebrities are often deified, treated as invincible and beyond the vulnerabilities of ordinary people. But what Lee saw was a man disintegrating. The body that had moonwalked across global stages was failing. The mind that had created some of the greatest music of the modern era was unraveling under pressure. And the soul behind the performer was, by her account, crying out for help that few seemed truly able or willing to give. Her account points to the normalization of extreme medical interventions in Jackson's private world. That he would even ask a holistic nurse for something as extreme as propofol suggests he was used to making such requests and used to hearing compliance. The boundary between safe care and dangerous indulgence had eroded long ago. Lee's refusal was not just a personal decision. It was a professional stand against a pattern that had likely been playing out for years. But Jackson's persistence also reveals how far the insomnia had taken him. Sleep, something so basic, so essential to human functioning, had become a battleground in his life. He wasn't simply tired. He was chronically, deeply, and dangerously sleep-deprived. The kind of insomnia he suffered from wasn't solved by herbal teas or even conventional medication. It had moved into the realm of surgical-level sedation, the kind administered in operating rooms, not bedrooms. That he believed this was his only solution speaks volumes about how desperate his nights had become. What makes Lee's story all the more tragic is that she genuinely tried to help him. She wanted to find a way to treat his condition without sacrificing his safety. She wasn't drawn in by his fame. She was moved by his suffering. But in Jackson's world, where deadlines loomed larger than personal well-being, where success was measured in sold-out arenas rather than moments of peace, that kind of care was often drowned out by more immediate demands. Lee's narrative forces a reconsideration of the line between celebrity and patient, between entertainment and exploitation. It shows what happens when a person is treated more as a product than a human being. Jackson's requests weren't just medical, they were symbolic. They were the cries of a man who no longer had control over his own body, who was forced to perform even when his body screamed for rest, who had been so thoroughly consumed by the demands of his image that he began to risk everything for just a few hours of sleep. In those days, according to Lee, Jackson was functioning like a man walking a tightrope over a void. He was rehearsing, planning, preparing, but underneath it all, he was unraveling. He knew in some part of himself that the sleep he craved could also kill him, but he chose to believe otherwise. Or perhaps he simply couldn't bear to care anymore. When rest becomes more important than waking, when unconsciousness feels safer than awareness, something has gone terribly wrong. Lee saw that. She tried to intervene, and when she couldn't, she carried the burden of that failure with her long after he was gone. Her revelations do not just add detail to the chronology of Jackson's final months, they reshape the emotional narrative. They place the focus not on scandal or spectacle, but on human fragility. In her story, Jackson isn't just a star fallen from the sky. He's a man worn down by a lifetime of pressure, searching desperately for a way out of the cycle that had trapped him. Cherilyn Lee couldn't give him what he wanted, but in sharing her story, she gave the world a clearer picture of what he needed and, tragically, of what he never truly received. Despite the storm of interpretations that followed Michael Jackson's death, the perspective of Cherilyn Lee remains one of the most quietly devastating accounts because it captures a moment when intervention was still possible, but ultimately ineffective. While the public was caught up in speculation about prescriptions, doctors, and responsibility, Lee's experience illuminated a subtler, more personal tragedy. Hers was not the vantage point of someone entangled in legal fallout or media frenzy. It was the view of someone who had sat across from Jackson, looked into his tired eyes, and seen a man worn down to the core. What makes Lee's account uniquely harrowing is how it reveals the enormous weight of silence. In those final months, Jackson was surrounded by people, yet few were truly listening. The hum of tour preparation, the excitement over a comeback, the transactional noise of celebrity management, all of it drowned out his soft but persistent pleas for help. Lee's refusal to participate in the more dangerous aspects of his care was not only a medical decision, it was an ethical stand in a world where ethics had often been blurred by money, fame, and denial. But Jackson's state of mind during these final interactions also cannot be overlooked. By the time he requested propofol from Lee, he wasn't operating with the clarity of someone who simply needed assistance. There was a distorted logic at work. Sleep had become more than a medical necessity. It had become a symbol of relief, an escape hatch from everything he couldn't control. He wasn't trying to die. He was trying to disappear, even if only temporarily, from a reality that felt unbearable. The drug represented that vanishing point, and the moment Lee denied him access to it, he was already recalculating how to get it elsewhere. What Lee's experience hints at, but never states directly, is the extent to which Jackson may have compartmentalized his life. With her, he sought healing through natural remedies and holistic approaches. With others, he sought sedation, oblivion. It's possible he genuinely wanted both. His body craved health and strength, his mind craved silence and peace. This split between intention and behavior was likely exacerbated by decades of being commodified. Jackson was not just a musician, he was a global phenomenon, a spectacle that demanded perfection even when he was unraveling internally. This schism within Jackson mirrored the disconnection in the infrastructure around him. The people in his life were not all connected or coordinated. There was no unified care team or guiding medical principle. Each person played a role, some nurturing, some enabling, some merely indifferent. Lee's presence was like a small voice of reason in an echo chamber of urgency and appeasement. She wasn't there to maintain the illusion of invincibility, she was there to restore equilibrium. But by then, the illusion had been feeding for too long, growing stronger than the man himself. Lee's role also highlights the overlooked tension between traditional and holistic medicine in high-profile environments. Celebrities with access to every possible treatment and expert often find themselves cobbling together a patchwork of care that lacks cohesion. Jackson's use of both natural therapies and heavy sedatives shows a system in conflict. One side urged patience and slow healing, the other promised quick solutions, albeit with high risks. This fragmented approach didn't allow for sustainable recovery. It only deepened the crisis by masking the symptoms rather than confronting the root cause. Her attempt to provide real care, however, also speaks volumes about her understanding of Jackson as more than just a patient. Lee wasn't looking at charts or lab results alone. She was watching behavior, listening between the lines, feeling the emotional temperature of a person slowly losing his grip. In many ways, she functioned less as a nurse and more as a last emotional checkpoint. Jackson, for reasons known only to him, trusted her enough to speak candidly about a drug that most would never discuss with a holistic practitioner. That choice suggests he saw in her a final possibility for rescue, or at least acknowledgement. One of the more subtle yet powerful aspects of Lee's story is how it exposes the illusion of autonomy in Jackson's world. From the outside, he appeared to be in control, managing a tour, rehearsing, calling the shots. But Lee's account suggests something more troubling. When someone becomes dependent on a system that serves their fame rather than their health, autonomy becomes an illusion. Jackson may have believed he was directing his care, but in truth, he was being carried along by forces much larger than himself. The machine needed him to function, even when he clearly could not. The environment that surrounded Jackson in those last weeks was not conducive to healing. The countdown to the This Is It tour was intensifying. Rehearsals were grueling, expectations soaring. The world awaited his return with breathless anticipation. But that anticipation didn't include concern for his well-being. There was no pause, no space carved out for genuine recovery. His physical condition was crumbling under the weight of public expectation. Yet all anyone saw was the perfectly executed choreography and that still magnetic stage presence. Lee's experience is important precisely because it pierces through that illusion. It reminds us that beneath the grandeur there was a man asking for help in the only way he knew how. And while some might interpret his requests as manipulative or reckless, Lee saw something more complex, a deep yearning to be rescued from the momentum of his own life. Her refusal wasn't cruelty, it was an act of integrity. But in Jackson's desperate state, integrity might have felt like abandonment. The emotional gravity of Lee's position cannot be overstated. To sit across from someone you've sworn to help, someone whose fame has touched billions, and refuse their plea, knowing that they may find someone else willing to say yes, is a weight few could carry easily. Yet she made that choice. And in the aftermath of Jackson's death, that decision became even more harrowing. Her silence in the immediate aftermath wasn't strategic, it was mournful. Her eventual speaking out came not from a place of blame, but from a desire to make sense of a tragedy that should have been avoided. The sadness in her story lies in its stillness. She did not accompany Jackson into his final hours. She wasn't there when his body gave in. Her part ended when her ethical boundaries collided with his desperation. And that final separation, professional but irrevocable, adds to the heartbreak. She had entered his life to help, but help only works when accepted. And Jackson, though he may have trusted her, was already convinced that his solution lay elsewhere. What unfolds through Lee's testimony is also a warning about the nature of celebrity and vulnerability. Fame doesn't prevent suffering, it amplifies it. Jackson's inability to sleep wasn't just physical, it was symbolic of a deeper unrest, a haunting that couldn't be quieted by applause or accolades. The same world that elevated him refused to let him rest. Every solution offered was transactional, every remedy temporary. The long-term healing he needed was incompatible with the life he was being asked to lead. Lee's position outside the usual circle of enablers gave her a clarity others lacked. She wasn't financially dependent on his success. She wasn't drawn into the vortex of yes men. Her professional independence allowed her to see the crisis for what it was. And that perspective, however lonely, gave her the courage to act in ways others would not. But her story is also a cautionary tale about the limits of good intention in a system built on performance rather than preservation. The image of Jackson that emerges through her recollections is fragile, fragmented, and deeply human. He wasn't the untouchable icon in her presence. He was someone pleading for help in whispered tones, someone exhausted by years of trying to outrun pain. And in those final conversations with Lee, his vulnerability was not a performance. It was a surrender, one last failed hope that someone might have a safer answer. Her refusal to administer propofol was, in that sense, a final act of love. Not the enabling love of fans or the strategic love of managers, but the stern love of someone who sees danger and refuses to participate. Jackson may not have recognized it as such, but history might. For in that decision, Lee preserved a sliver of truth in a life otherwise clouded by illusion. She bore witness to his suffering without exploiting it, and in doing so, she added a human dimension to a figure so often treated as myth. Lee's role in Michael Jackson's story is not one of controversy, but of clarity. She entered his life briefly, but left a lasting impression both on him and on the narrative that followed. Her account invites reflection not only on what happened in those final days, but on what didn't happen, on the interventions that were never coordinated, the warnings that went unheeded, the ethical stands that were not taken until it was too late. There's also a profound discomfort in realizing how rare someone like Lee was in Jackson's circle. In a world overflowing with compliance and convenience, she was the exception. And in that exception lies the lesson. If more voices like hers had been present, more professionals willing to say no, to pause the machine, to protect rather than exploit, perhaps the outcome would have been different. Perhaps the final chapter wouldn't have been written in sedatives and silence. But Lee's story endures not because it offers a solution in hindsight, but because it gives depth to the final portrait of a man the world thought it knew. Through her eyes, we see not the superstar but the insomniac, not the performer but the patient, not the icon but the individual. Her story doesn't diminish Jackson, it humanizes him. And in doing so, it asks us to look beyond the stage lights and remember that even the brightest stars burn out when they are denied the chance to rest. In every detail she shared, Lee brought forward the reminder that at the heart of this global tragedy was a simple, heartbreaking truth. A man who could not sleep, surrounded by a world that would not let him stop. She saw him for who he was, not just for what he meant to others. And that vision, clear, unsensational, honest, is perhaps the most vital piece of understanding we have when it comes to the final days of Michael Jackson. The days preceding Michael Jackson's death were shrouded not just in secrecy, but in a quiet, almost desperate ritual of seeking control, a paradox for a man whose life was anything but private. In that small, shrinking space between his fame and his fragility, Jackson was reaching out, carefully choosing people like Cherilyn Lee not to broadcast his suffering, but to manage it discreetly. Her presence in his life during that final stretch sheds light on how intricately he attempted to navigate his declining condition while maintaining the illusion of mastery over it. What often goes unacknowledged in discussions of Jackson's final chapter is the intense pressure he placed on himself to present a state of health and readiness that was increasingly out of sync with reality. The This Is It tour was not just a professional endeavor. It was a monumental return, a reclamation of stature and relevance that carried emotional weight beyond ticket sales. For Jackson, it represented redemption, and within that emotional framework, any admission of weakness, particularly something as nebulous and difficult as insomnia or fatigue, felt like failure. His request for propofol, even as it flew in the face of standard medical logic, was not just about sleep. It was about preserving his ability to perform, to deliver, to meet the towering expectations others had for him and he had for himself. This was the context within which Cherilyn Lee operated. Unlike the entourage of advisors, lawyers, and coordinators who were invested in Jackson the brand, Lee encountered Jackson the human being. Their sessions were private, removed from the spectacle, offering a rare, stripped-down version of a man trying to preserve what little was left of his autonomy. Her attempts to treat him were aimed not at preserving a public image, but at restoring balance to a system already collapsing internally. But the resistance she faced wasn't overt aggression or denial. Instead, it was a quiet, persistent belief on Jackson's part that she could not understand what his body needed the way he did. Lee's refusal to supply propofol didn't trigger anger or outrage from Jackson, it triggered a deep disappointment. That reaction underscores how far his perception of normalcy had drifted. In his world, resistance was the exception. He had become used to compliance. Whether through deference, fear, or opportunism, those around him often ceded their professional boundaries in favor of his requests. Lee's stance stood in contrast, not because she was braver than the others, but because her relationship with him was grounded in care rather than career. She had nothing to gain by feeding the dysfunction, and everything to lose by stepping beyond the ethics of her profession. Her recollection of his demeanor, tired, pleading yet controlled, reflects a man who was not entirely disconnected from reality but whose sense of urgency was vastly outpacing his reason. Jackson wasn't out of touch with the risks. He understood them, even discussed them, but he had reached a point where the risk seemed preferable to the alternative: prolonged sleeplessness, declining energy, and the potential collapse of his comeback. For someone whose identity had been fused with performance since childhood, the fear of letting others down was as grave as the fear of personal injury. It wasn't that he didn't fear death, it was that he feared disappointment more. There was a ritualistic element to the way he sought sleep. A rehearsed plea, a controlled request, a calculated understanding of what to ask for and when. This suggests a long-term pattern, one honed over time through trial, error, and unfortunately, reinforcement from those who had previously said yes. Jackson's knowledge of the drug, his precise terminology, and his rationale for using it didn't emerge overnight. It pointed to experience, and worse, to a system that had allowed that experience to evolve unchecked. He wasn't experimenting. He was repeating what had worked before, even if it meant walking a razor's edge. Lee's warnings were not abstract. She laid out the risks with clinical precision, detailing what could go wrong if such a substance was misused outside a clinical setting. But what she couldn't alter was Jackson's growing resignation. He didn't refute her knowledge or dispute her warnings. He simply didn't believe he had any other option. That acceptance, the internal agreement with a destructive solution, is what made Lee's position so tragic. She saw the collapse coming. She tried to redirect the course, but the decision had already been made, if not in words, then in mindset. What complicates this story even more is the duality of Jackson's environment. On the one hand, he had access to every conceivable resource: top-tier specialists, advanced treatments, custom care. He was trapped in a structure that often enabled the very behaviors undermining his health. The infrastructure built to support his greatness was, paradoxically, one that also made it easier for him to hide in plain sight. He could suffer deeply and still perform spectacularly. He could be deteriorating internally while delivering flawless rehearsals. This ability to compartmentalize made it nearly impossible for those around him to fully grasp the severity of his condition, unless, like Lee, they were allowed into that vulnerable space. And yet, even within that space, Jackson retained a certain detachment. He never surrendered entirely to her methods, even though he trusted her enough to discuss propofol. That delicate balance of trust and control defined many of his relationships. He allowed access but maintained distance. He accepted advice but reserved final decisions for himself. It created a dynamic where professionals like Lee were placed in a holding pattern, present, involved, concerned, but unable to intervene in the way their instincts demanded. In this context, the psychological weight on Lee must have been immense. To watch someone approach the edge, to know the probable outcome, and still be powerless to reroute the trajectory, this isn't just professionally frustrating, it's emotionally crushing, especially when the person in question is not just a patient, but a cultural icon whose life and death would reverberate across the globe. Lee didn't just witness a medical crisis, she witnessed a human unraveling constrained by the walls of celebrity, performance, and unrelenting demand. There's also a deeper dimension to consider, the loneliness of Jackson's position. Fame is often described as isolating, but in his case, it was a fortress. His life was orchestrated, curated, guarded. Genuine relationships were rare, unfiltered conversations even rarer. Lee represented a crack in that wall, a temporary breach where honesty could surface. But that kind of honesty was also threatening. For someone who had spent years mastering the art of projection, of appearing larger than life, confronting the stark reality of needing help was a destabilizing experience. The implication of Lee's story is not just that Jackson was failed by individuals, but that he was failed by a system, one that blurred boundaries, rewarded compliance, and discouraged dissent. Lee, in defying that system, became an anomaly. And in the end, anomalies rarely survive in environments resistant to change. Her voice, measured, ethical, and unwavering, was precisely what Jackson needed more of, but far too little of it remained around him by the time the final countdown began. As Jackson pushed forward with tour preparations, his physical condition did not improve. Lee was no longer part of his care team by then, but her insights retrospectively offer a haunting clarity. He had turned to another medical provider, likely someone willing to administer what she had refused. And in that shift, the final pieces fell into place. The care he needed, integrated, ethical, preventive, was replaced by care that was reactive, transactional, and ultimately fatal. Lee's absence in those final days wasn't a failure on her part. It was the inevitable result of a system that had no space for refusal. Her recollections, though focused on a narrow time frame, paint a vivid picture of a larger tragedy. They reflect the story of a man who had been living on borrowed strength for far too long. A man whose legacy overshadowed his limitations. A man for whom rest had become a luxury, and for whom silence had become unbearable unless induced. And in that tragic pursuit of sleep, he found not the peace he sought, but the end he never intended. Perhaps the most sobering truth to emerge from Lee's experience is this: sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from those who openly harm, but from those who quietly agree. In saying no, Lee stood apart, not just in action, but in principle. Her refusal was a form of care far deeper than compliance could ever be. And in the wake of Jackson's death, that act resonates not as defiance, but as a quiet form of love. The kind that protects even when it's unwelcome. The kind that sees beyond fame to the person silently asking to be saved. Her voice continues to echo not because it offers answers, but because it asks better questions. What kind of systems allow harm to flourish beneath the surface of excellence? How do we safeguard the vulnerable when their power disguises their pain? And how can professionals retain their ethics in environments designed to erode them? Cherilyn Lee didn't stop Jackson from seeking propofol, but in refusing to be a part of that descent, she gave the world a glimpse of what ethical care looks like, even in the face of overwhelming pressure. Through her, the final days of Michael Jackson take on a different tone, not just of tragedy, but of missed possibility. She represents what might have been, a chance to slow the descent, to rebuild rather than sedate, to confront rather than conceal. And while that chance ultimately slipped away, her story remains not as a condemnation, but as a call to remember that even the brightest stars need protectors, not just promoters. The memory of her role stands not as a footnote to Jackson's legacy, but as a thread of humanity running through an otherwise scripted ending. She wasn't there for the spotlight or the spectacle. She was there for the man. And in the end, that may be the most vital part of the story the world almost forgot. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Michael Jackson's nurse breaking silence after all these years? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.